Well, let's get started looking at Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. I just want to say a few things about the preface and introduction. On page 35, the book begins, "The form of this exposition may strike many readers as odd. To them it would seem too rigorous to be edifying, and too edifying to have the rigor of scholarship." One of the first things I think that you have to get used to in reading Kierkegaard is irony. Irony, what exactly is irony? That's one of those great high school questions that your English teacher asks you, and everybody sort of pretends to know what irony is, and no one can really define it. When someone's being ironic, they're certainly not being straightforward. They're not simply saying what they think. Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons for not coming out and just saying what you think. Whatever Kierkegaard's reasons were, I'll never know, but in reading this book over the years, that's what I'm used to in reading Kierkegaard, irony. Which is not to say that he's saying something he doesn't believe to be true, but that it all kind of depends on how you say what you say. And so irony for me means someone who is having fun and being funny. And Kierkegaard is one of the few genuinely funny philosophers, and I really hope that that comes out for us in reading Kierkegaard. Too edifying to be scholarly, that is, this is a self-help book. It's edifying. It's meant to improve the reader in some way. And scholars, and it's true in Kierkegaard's time and it's true now, generally look down on such books. I mean, scholars are supposed to be serious. Scholars are supposed to be about finding truth, whatever it is, not necessarily making people better, which is usually kind of sneered at by modern philosophers, at least, not ancient philosophers, as we know from reading Plato. What he was really up to was trying to make himself better, trying to make others better. So too edifying to be scholarly, and too scholarly to be edifying, which is to say that Kierkegaard knows that his work maybe doesn't fit exactly into the usual categories. It tries to be both scholarly and edifying. And in a humorous way, he's pointing out that it may fail at both because it tries to do both. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this book is supposed to be edifying. That is, it's really a self-help book. That is, this book, despite its impenetrability in some respects, its scholarliness, its craziness, really belongs in the Christian self-help section of a bookstore. But in that initial preface, if I can find it, he says one thing on page 35 which I think is very, very good to keep in mind in terms of coming to terms with what he's really getting at in this book and in what way it's supposed to be a self-help book. He's discussing what he calls Christian heroism towards the bottom of page 35. Whatever he means by that. But he says Christian heroism, and indeed one perhaps sees little enough of that, is to risk unreservedly, being oneself, an individual human being, this specific individual human being, alone before God, alone in this enormous exertion and this enormous accountability. That notion that really all we're called upon to do as human beings, and all we can really hope for, is to be ourselves. There's something maybe ironical there, and certainly paradoxical, because it would seem that in a certain respect we can't help but be ourselves. It's not something you have to try to do. You're kind of sentenced in a way to be yourself, and that's part of the book too, as we'll see. You're stuck being yourself. But in another respect, being oneself, that is, being this particular human being in one's real situation, which for Kierkegaard is, as we'll see, being in the presence of God and being aware of being in the presence of God, is the hardest thing in the world to do. So that's quite important to keep in mind, and to keep in mind throughout the reading of the book. I think that, like reading The Republic, where you sort of, the book goes everywhere, but you have to keep in mind, hey, he's supposed to prove that the just life is better than the unjust life. That always has to be kept in mind, no matter how far afield the argument gets in The Republic, no matter how strange the argument gets in The Sickness Unto Death. A good thing to hold on to is that Kierkegaard, at the end of the day, is just saying we must be ourselves. We must be who we are. Another thing to look at, I think, is after the preface, there is an introduction, which is quite interesting and important, and gives you the biblical references, which is the most important being the story of Lazarus in the New Testament. And the difference, of course, between the sickness unto death and the sickness unto death, which is, of course, another joke, another paradox. You sort of repeat the expression, but it means two entirely different things. Kierkegaard is saying to the atheist, or the natural man, or the pagan, which is the person who is referred to by these various expressions, who lives in a world without God, or at least believes they live in a world without God, as opposed to the Christian. To the natural man, or pagan, or atheist, the sickness unto death is one thing. To the Christian, the sickness unto death is quite another thing, of course, because the Christian doesn't believe in the sickness unto death in the former meaning of it. That is, the Christian believes that he or she has something everlasting and eternal in them that cannot die. And so the sickness unto death to the Christian means something quite different. It may mean, as we'll see, separation from God, the denial of God. And as we'll see, I don't want to give it away, but if you skip ahead in the book to the last section, it means sin, which has a very specific meaning for Kierkegaard. So what's really striking about these two differences of opinion, I think, can be found on page 38. He says, this then is the measure of the high-mindedness with which Christianity has taught the Christian to think of all that is worldly, death included. It's almost as if the Christian were supposed to vaunt this proud elevation above all that humanity normally calls misfortune, over what humanity normally calls the greatest evil. But then Christianity has discovered in its turn a misery which humanity as such does not know exists. This misery is the sickness unto death. What the natural man counts as terrible, when it is all added up and he can think of no remainder, all this the Christian treats as a joke. Such is the relation between the natural man and the Christian. It is like that between a child and an adult. What the child shrinks from in horror, the adult thinks nothing of. The child doesn't know what is horrifying. The adult knows, and he shrinks from it in horror. The sickness unto death in the second sense, in the Christian sense, is much more horrifying than mere mortality, mere death, mere my life coming to an end. And it shows you kind of like what Kierkegaard is getting at, or where he's coming from, I should say. He's coming from a Christian perspective. He makes no attempt in this book to prove that the existence of God is true, or that the Christian perspective is in some way the only true one. He kind of assumes that. And in that last one, you get a sense of what that entails. One of the things it entails is that for the Christian, there is something much, much worse than mortal death. What the true version of the sickness unto death is, which will gradually emerge and really come out in the last part of the book, which is called Despair of Sin.